On behalf of all of us here at the LJS and online, I would like to welcome Rabbi Dr. Andrew Goldstein, together with you, Sharon. Rabbi Goldstein was the first and founding rabbi of Northwood and Pinner Liberal Synagogue, now the Ark Synagogue, which he served from 1970, when he was ordained, until his retirement in 2008. He is now the emeritus rabbi of the community, where his son, Rabbi Aaron Goldstein, is now rabbi. Retirement is perhaps the wrong word to describe Rabbi Goldstein's work in the last 14 years. Until recently, he was president of Liberal Judaism. He continues to teach, to study, having been in charge of the ULPS, as it then was, Education Department, and with his great interest in liberal Judaism in Central and Eastern Europe, he continues to travel to different communities, having organized tours to places of Jewish interest, including Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, the southern states of America, and many other places. He and Sharon have been particularly instrumental in developing liberal Judaism in the Czech and Slovak republics, and was chair of the European Union for Progressive Judaism. He co-edited the Liberal Judaism Haggadah and the High Holy Day Mahzor, and I was privileged to be on the committee which he chaired that produced Siddur Lev Chadash, our prayer book. We are delighted to welcome you both to the LJS this morning, and Rabbi Goldstein, look forward to hearing your sermon.
Thank you. It's at my age, it's good to be reminded who you are. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be invited to preach at the LJS, and I'm glad to return for a second time in the 120th year of liberal Judaism. Amongst other things, it gives me the opportunity to wish Rabbi Wright well as she takes over from me as president of our movement, fitting as 8 of the 10 presidents to date have been members of the LJS. Sharon and I came yesterday afternoon, from a wonderful week in Cornwall. And therefore, I did not have at hand the sermon that was preached to the Jewish Religious Union, as our movement was called initially, preached on the first Shabbat in November 1902. I suspect it did not take its theme from the weekly Torah portion, and certainly not from the one chosen for this morning. In those days, most sermons were not based on the Torah reading, and in the first few years, a Torah reading was not part of the service. Getting home, I found that the sermon on that day was given by Israel Abrahams with the title, The Imitation of God, urging us to act in our lives as God acts in the Bible, clothing the naked, healing the sick, and bringing comfort to the bereaved. Actually, reading it, I realized it was a great sermon, and Israel Abraham certainly had a way of writing. And intriguingly, his text comes not from the Torah, but from the Song of Songs. I was asleep, but my heart waked, he says. And he stresses the words were made by, as he says, the maiden, the female lead in the Song of Songs, and talks of God as the Shekhinah. Amazing. It could well be a sermon based on our Torah reading and the Haftarah we read today, 120 years later, about wronged but strong and brave women Maybe it actually was, and I didn't realize it. But I'm not going to base my sermon on the passages we read this morning, but on the very title and the opening words of the Sedra, Lech Lecha, get thee out. Liberal Judaism is in its 120th year, and I was recently searching through the rabbis who served the congregation of my youth, the Birmingham Liberal Synagogue, as it was until it chickened out and became progressive. It led me to read one of the source texts, no, not the Bible or Talmud, but the history of liberal Judaism, composed by the late Rosita Rosenberg and Lawrence Riegel. And it made me realize that the founding rabbi of this congregation certainly obeyed the command, Lech Lecha, get thee out, as he was involved in meetings initiating new communities all around the country and beyond. Of course, usually he was accompanied by the Honourable Lily Montague and occasionally by the third M, Claude Montefiore. They didn't have to travel far in 1928 to jointly conduct the first service at Miss Lily's West Central Synagogue, Alav Shalom. However, the same year they travelled to Liverpool to start the process of founding the liberal congregation there. And 6 years later, Montague and Mattock held the first liberal service in Birmingham. They were accompanied, I read, by the LJS choir. And I note that donors from this congregation paid for the first rabbi in Birmingham, Rabbi David Seligson, who actually conducted my parents' wedding in 1937. In 1937, Dr. Mattock went down to Brighton, and I note that the first service was held in a house that was not wired for electricity. No doubt it was the first and only gaslit liberal synagogue service. There was a missionary zeal, a belief in their approach to Judaism, and I think their deeply held belief that they really felt that they were doing God's work. Not just delivering a form of Judaism that appealed to a goodly proportion of Jews in the years after the so-called Great War, but convinced that it was a form of Judaism that was for the future. A rational, intellectual, inclusive Judaism that was bound to flourish in the world of the 1920s and 30s. And indeed, looking at the motives of the founders of Birmingham and Brighton and later Dublin, it was not for the easy option or for the conversion to Judaism. For the first liberal Jews were practicing Orthodox Jews who saw the light and started and joined liberal synagogues because they believed in our progressive principles and did so very often against the opposition of family and friends. This first period of growth of liberal Judaism came after the First World War into a time of austerity and strikes. Mattock and Montague took the message of liberal Judaism into that world with a firm conviction. Surely we live in similar times, but do we have our founders' conviction? A troubled world. It's frightening to listen to the news each day or open a newspaper. Interest rates, energy prices, cutbacks to care and health, global warming, Putin's war on Ukraine and against the stability of much of the rest of the world. And if there's not enough, this week the elections in Israel must trouble us deeply. For the pronouncements and intentions of the new right-wing key holders goes against everything that liberal Judaism and liberal Jews hold dear. Our thoughts must go to our brave, progressive colleagues in Israel, who must fight even harder to create a fair and just and humane, and I would say a country based on Jewish values. It's true that the fastest growing form of Judaism is the Haredi end of the spectrum, facing a troubled world by retreating into a cozy and comforting community of unquestioning belief. And this approach certainly works for many, but for many others, it's not acceptable. What did Mattock and Montague take out into the troubled world of the late 1920s? A twin message of social action, of concern for the poor and a firm belief into, as Miss Lily said, the spiritual possibilities of liberal Judaism. And I think Lily Montague was the one who stressed the phrase prophetic Judaism. This twin message and action is surely needed all the more in 2022. To get actively involved in the difficulties the poor and not so poor will face in the year ahead. The care for the homeless and the refugees, you know the social action agenda, and this synagogue, I know, is well at its forefront. But liberal Judaism also asks us, as Miss Lily would claim, to proclaim the spiritual benefits that religious observance and prayer can bring to the troubled heart. And here we might take another role model, this time from a Haftarah, Hannah, whose deep sorrow brought her close to God, and there she found comfort and success. And the priest Eli's words to her bring us back to the opening words of the Sedra, when Avram and Sarai were urged, Lech lecha, get thee out, go and proclaim God's message to the world. And what did Eli say to Hannah? Lechi l'shalom, go out in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your request. Our founders acted on these words and took up the challenge, Lech lecha. Let us be encouraged and seek to follow their example and take liberal Judaism into new decades with added vigor. Maybe the message of the 120th anniversary of their journey is a call for us to hear, Lech lecha, and as in Debbie Friedman's song, Lehilach, go out and share the good news that the inclusive, compassionate, intellectually sound liberal Judaism our founders proclaimed is valid and so much needed today, and it will bring people back to Judaism, to the God of Israel. And may the God of Israel bring peace and righteousness and tolerance back to Zion, for that is the only way that Israel will find peace.